Well, we're beginning our presentation ceremony now, and we have planned to start off with a treat. Chairman Levitt is going to be piping in from, judging from the area code, Connecticut somewhere. And if we can overcome our technical difficulties. Hello? Well, why don't we we'll get started, and maybe we'll just be broadcasting to the Levitt household. Chairman Levitt, this is Mercer Bullard.
Yes.
Can everybody hear? Yeah. We are at the awards ceremony, and we're looking forward to your comments on Barb's, I'm sure, interactions with the SEC over the years and any other insights you have. So the floor is yours.
Well, Barbara first came to my attention through Howard Metzenbaum. And early in my years at the commission, she was the focal point for what was right and what was wrong. I heard from her frequently, always in the interests of investors, always in the interest of what was fair and what was right. Her priorities were investor interests first, last, and always, regardless of market structure or the technicalities of SEC rulemaking. Everything that Barbara did or said was a reflection of how this impacted the average U.S. investor. It came to a point where, before any major commission rulemaking, I touched base with Barb. I didn't always agree with her, but more often than not, she persuaded me to do what was right and what was best. So I applaud those of you who are honoring her today, and I think we can only do a fraction of what we really owe to her for her lifelong dedication to what's best for U.S. investors and ultimately U.S. markets.
Thank you very much for your comment. You're of course welcome to stay on the phone and receive by radio, if you will. Not a lot is actually happening up on the dais, but in any case, thank you very much for joining us today.
You're quite welcome.
Okay, so we are here, of course, to honor Barb for her years of service. I'm here because Barbara DeMott couldn't make it. A pigeon flew into the engine of her plane while it was on the tarmac. Although I heard from SIFMA that it was the plane that flew into the pigeon, but we'll see about that. Not many of you know this, but Barb is actually my older sister, mythologically speaking. We both have the same parent, Mars, and something you may not know about Mars. This was a co-parenting arrangement with Mercury, and that's how I got my name, but I don't know where Barbara came from. But that is kind of descriptive of what she has brought to the securities law field over the years. She may not remember this when she was a small child, she was raised by a number of teenagers named Phyllis, Brooksley, and Tamar, I heard. And the first word she ever uttered, I think, was defiance. And then the first sentence, I think, was, it was a command, question authority. And then when I heard Tamar talking about a little more pain is necessary, I think that might have been also part of her early upbringing. Barb has been lobbying these issues we've been talking about for 2 centuries. Over 2 centuries. She was on the fiduciary issues back in the 90s when no one else was really looking at what was going to become a critical issue in the securities regulatory field. She has been a diligent fighter, and as I've noted in our release, the most fearsome investor advocate out there. And she has done so under increasingly difficult conditions over the last 15 or 16 years. As you may be aware, the tide has turned a little bit, not necessarily in favor of investor advocates' positions. In fact, the word she would use to describe it, from her inimitable vocabulary of a Princeton graduate, would I think be craptastic, right? But I'll leave her to explain exactly what that means. So she has, especially in connection with the DOL rule, demonstrated that her second love in life, other than protecting investors, is killing trees, because she has managed to out-detail and outright just about everyone else in the field on those issues with a staff of 1 or 0. And in that case, I think she has managed to make better and more persuasive, stronger arguments that I've seen in the field. So I would like to also, in addition to Chairman Levitt's input, ask Phyllis to make a few comments as well. You can sit or...
Oh yeah, maybe I'll just sit. So it's hard for me to imagine. I wish I could say to you that I've known Barb for 50 years or 30 years or 20 years. It's hard for me to imagine how I couldn't have known her. You know, they say that everybody's got their double here in the world, and I kind of think that there's something to that. You know, at the Department of Labor, our press people we'd get this circulation of the daily clips, and a prominent, you know, these were things that affected all the Department of Labor activities. But a prominent piece of it, of course, as the years went by, was devoted to the conflict of interest fiduciary rule. We called it the fiduciary rule in the first place because we were amending the definition of fiduciary, and then we were told that nobody understood what that was. And so they asked if we could call it something more direct that people would understand. So we call it conflict of interest. I noticed the industry people won't call it conflict of interest. They have to call it fiduciary because that makes it too complicated. But anyway, in the clips every day, Barbara was almost always quoted. And somebody, usually at our morning daily staff meeting, somebody would say, look, did you see what Barb said today? She's channeling you. And I would say, no, I channel her. Because Barb has a way that I admire incredibly of being able to cut through all the BS and get right to the heart of the matter. And I never thought that I'd ever meet somebody as energetic and passionate and indefatigable, if that's a word. As, you know, if my parents were alive and they met Barb, they would be terrified that that there was another one like me. But I always considered Barb my sister from a different mother, because I thought there were so many things alike that we had. But Barb is far superior to anything I could ever be or want to be. There's so many wonderful things I could say about her, but I want to talk quickly about 3 things that I admire the most. She's smart. She's smart as a whip. It's much smarter than I could ever be, much smarter than probably all of us collectively could be. She's strategic. Now, last night she tried to pass off the strategy piece of this to Maureen, but Barb is incredibly strategic. And most of all, what I admire about Barb is that she's succinct. It's very easy for you to blab on, as you can see from my remarks, about something. But when you take a concept or a thought and put it into a few pithy words, that's brilliance, and that's Barb. I was so thrilled when Knut asked me if I would come and say a few words about her, because Barb has been, for me, a wonderful teacher. I'm an ERISA lawyer. I don't really know anything about securities, but she's taught me more than I ever thought I could ever learn. She's been an inspiration to me. She has been a wonderful nudge, because she's always reminding us that there's one more step, one more thing that we can do. And it's not in a negative way. It's just, she's a nudge. And most of all, I want to thank Barb because she's been a wonderful partner. We would have never gotten this rule over the finish line without Barb and many of you in this room and a lot of our other colleagues, both out of the industry, in the advocacy community, and in the industry. And it's, so I can't think of a better person to be honored than Barb.
Thanks very much, Phyllis. I reiterate those views, and I got to know Barb beginning in January of 2000 when I started doing advocacy, and I was calling around different groups to convince them that mutual funds, being the most profitable investment that anyone had ever had over the preceding couple of decades, really needed a lot of advocacy work on them. Barb was the one who was willing to bite, and fortunately for us, the market crashed. And it has been a pleasure working with her. We have literally worked on dozens of letters together, and I've learned an enormous amount, not just about analysis and the law, but also drafting, attention to detail, and a level of commitment that I haven't found in many colleagues, if ever. We're here today, of course, to honor her with an award that we had very little difficulty reaching a decision on. The committee is made up of me and Brooksley, who you know, Michael Koffler, who is at Sutherland, is it Everlands now, I think? And Canute, of course. And we unanimously thought that there was no better person that we could award the prize to this year than Barb. So I want to bring you up, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Let me get out of this picture.
So, I can't begin to tell you how much this means to me, but I think I'm supposed to try. So first of all, they tell you that you can judge a man by the company that he keeps, and there is no company I would rather be judged by than the previous recipients of this award, including the most recent previous recipient. I mean, these are real giants in the field, so I am incredibly honored to be considered in the same group. When I was hired at CFA 31 years ago this month, and assigned to do a study on abuses in the financial planning industry, I don't think I knew what the word fiduciary meant. I certainly didn't know I was going to make it my life's work. But, you know, over the years, when I'd work on different investor protection issues, you know, it could be penny stock reforms or limited partnership roll-ups or whatever it was, inappropriate sale of B shares, it always came back to sort of the same fundamental point, which is that average investors are just incredibly vulnerable. They turn to financial professionals for advice. They have a reasonable expectation that that financial advisor is going to act in their best interests. And our regulations simply have not kept up. They have not provided that assurance. So, you know, I decided early on that the single most important thing that we could and should do to better protect the sort of average, unsophisticated investor was to ensure that the financial professionals that they rely on are subject to a strong, enforceable fiduciary standard that requires them to set aside their own financial interests and act in the best interests of their customer. And of course, you know, so I'm 31 years into this, and last year we actually got a win in the Department of Labor rule, and it was really fun to be at this event last year. It was so celebratory, right? And you know, it's tough to be back here now and in a different environment where we're fighting, you know, tooth and nail to defend, you know, that. But it's a fight that is, you know, well worth fighting, and that we will keep fighting regardless. And, you know, in that struggle, you know, because it has over the years, I mean, it has felt a lot like swimming against the stream. You know, it's a small group here, but there are so many people in this crowd who have either taught me or inspired me or supported me in that effort. And in the inspirational category, we have Brooksley Bourne and Phyllis Boise, the two women whose faces should be on every "Nevertheless She Persisted" t-shirt that's ever been made, right? You know, that teach the lesson that just because someone tells you can't do this, just because someone tells you you're wrong, just because someone tells you it's, I don't know, unworkable, you should listen to what they say in case they picked up on something that you're missing, right? But if they haven't, if all you've got is bluster, then you stick with it and you keep fighting. So inspiration, much appreciated. You know, there've also been, I'm not an attorney. That may have been evident from my remarks earlier. It often is. And I think there are ways in which that's an advantage. You know, you better understand what someone who doesn't know what the securities laws mean, although, you know, like it was such a revelation when I realized that best interest didn't mean best interest. You know, that was kind of an eye-opener. But there are three of the most eminent experts on fiduciary law in this room. And, you know, when I was writing my last tome, comment letter to the SEC, and I, you know, went back to remind myself, what is it that we really mean when we say someone has a duty of loyalty and a duty of care? I found myself reading Fiduciary Law by Tamar Frankel and a recent piece by Arthur Labey, in which they, you know, carefully lay out in terms that a non-lawyer can understand what it is that we're fighting for here, you know, what it is that these standards are supposed to mean. And then, of course, there's Mercer, who has, you know, he said when he formed Fund Democracy, when I started, you know, like today when we work on these issues, it feels like there's like a battalion of groups that work together to support and defend the deal well rule. It was kind of lonely in the 80s and 90s, right? You know, the consumer movement had not prioritized investor protection. I was kind of you know, it's easy to be the leading investor advocate when you're the only investor advocate. So when, you know, Mercer came along and he, you know, formed Fund Democracy, joined the fight, said he'd be willing to fight on the fiduciary issue side by side, even though it was a little far afield from his chosen field of mutual fund issues. You know, suddenly I had my own securities law expert on speed dial, and he never let me down. So that I really appreciate as well. And then, you know, there are all of the people who have supported those efforts who, you know, sometimes get lost in the background. You know, I'm the one who gets to stand up on the podium and get the really lovely trophy, but there are a number of people who have helped in that process. And, you know, so one of them is Mary Malguar, sitting here in the front row, one of the secret heroes of the fiduciary movement. The first study I did for CFA was a study on abuses in financial planning profession. And to say that the financial planning community didn't like it was, you know, an understatement. And I got, you know, more than a few calls from angry planners. And so at the end of a day, when our secretary, Lydia, says, "Barbarita, there's a financial planner who wants to talk to you." I'm like, oh man. And I pick up the phone and it's Mary, and she says, "You know, this is great. You know, if anything, you haven't gone far enough." And, you know, and she was ready to join the fight, and she helped me to see how we could make this alignment between investor advocates and fiduciary advisors to advance this cause. And that has been a really important element of the strategy on this fight. And, you know, I would also be remiss if I didn't mention my husband, Pete, who's in the back of the room. Pete has endured more discussions of the fiduciary standard in 30 years than any human really ought to have to, often while preparing me dinner. And, you know, as he heard my latest rant or, provided a shoulder for my latest, despair. And, if it had gone differently today and for some reason emergency had struck and I hadn't been able to participate, I'm pretty sure Pete could have filled in without missing a beat. He knows the talking points. Maureen Thompson. And I may not get through this one without. Maureen and I have been working on this together forever, right? And the first time we'd known each other, we'd had a few interactions, but I had gone out to Maryland state legislature to testify. They had adopted a financial planning bill, and the brokers and the insurance agents and the accountants were all lined up explaining why it was a great bill as long as they weren't included. And I was going to testify, and I thought, I know this issue. I don't need to prepare remarks. I'll just see what they have to say and wing it. And I started hyperventilating because I actually don't do well if I don't think in advance about what I'm going to say. And Maureen had to talk me down from my little panic attack, took me out to lunch afterwards, got me through the event. It actually went quite well. I think I said that all they were asking from the Maryland State Legislature was the right to lie to their customers. So, the usual. And, we formed a friendship at that point that has lasted the decades. But beyond that, as Phyllis alluded to, Maureen is the strategy behind my policy wonkery. When we were in the middle of the Dodd-Frank fight and we were trying to get the Fiduciary Standard written into the law, I started every day calling Maureen and saying, what should I do? What is it that I should be doing today to try to make this policy a reality? So she is the strategy on how to accomplish what it is that I see needs to be accomplished. Can't thank you enough. And last, and far from least, and I can't do this one either, right? My colleague and dear friend, Micah Hauptman. Now, I knew 4 years ago when CFA agreed to hire Micah that I had won the lottery. I have been doing these issues solo at CFA for a long time, and here was this very bright, very talented young lawyer who was going to come work with me on these issues. And I am still amazed to this day to see how he has grown in his command of the topic and his expertise and how hard he works and how smart he works. And when you look at our comments, we have between the two of us together, we have written 6 comment letters since February to either the DOL or the SEC. They total about 300 pages, so, block out a little time if you want to see what we have to say. I'm not sure I could have survived it without Micah to work, but I sure as heck know that the letters wouldn't have been half as good without his incredible research and analysis and the partnership. So thanks, Micah.